Welcome to another edition of the Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and in this series of programs, we examine different aspects of public policy. And today we will be looking at aviation safety, which, in my view, and I'm sure in the view of many right-thinking Guyanese, is essential to economic stability, particularly of the hinterland. It's essential to national security. And for those persons who live in the hinterland, you can almost say it's essential to survival. Agriculture depends on aviation, communication, mining, of course, all of our mines, our main mines, gold, diamonds, and are in the hinterland. And if you consider some areas of Region 10, hinterland, the bauxite mines are there too. Tourism, our most beautiful areas in Pacaramas, and flora and fauna. These destinations can only be accessed by aircraft, or much slower and much more painfully by trail. Transportation, law enforcement. As you know, the coalition created 4 new police divisions in the hinterland in regions 1, 7, 8, and 9. And all of these areas are dependent on aviation and defense, or border defense. So main borders, our most troublesome borders, the one with Venezuela, nearly 800 kilometers. You could only access some of those areas by aircraft. And of course, the long Brazilian border, over 1,100 kilometers. Again, to get to the Rupununi, again, it's so painfully slow to go there by road, and it's quicker by air. But with the absence of highways, with the absence of railways, aircraft or aviation transport is essential to the development of the hinterland, and of course to security. And those of you who are old enough will remember in 1969, it was the courageous pilots of Guyanese pilots of the GSC who were able to deliver troops into the Rupununi to quell that attempted secession, the Rupununi Rebellion. And the rebels had taken the trouble to block the airstrips. And it is only because the Manari airstrip was clear that the the Dakota aircraft, DC-3 aircraft, were able to land, and troops were able to deploy and take control of the Rupununi. Later on that year, again, led by Guyanese pilots in the Guyana Airways Corporation at that time, using the twin otter planes, we were able to land at Jaguar in the New River and take control of that area, which is bigger than Jamaica. So aviation has saved this country, not only in terms of its economy, but also in terms of defending the entire New River zone and the Rupununi zone, which at that time, was threatening to secede from Ghana, our biggest region, bigger than Costa Rica. So these things would not have been possible without aviation. We must pay attention, therefore, to aviation, not only for border security, but also because emergencies. Sometimes there are terrible floods in the hinterland, Rupununi, and even up in Karasabai, you can get floods. But relief is provided by aviation, and GDF has the bigger carriers, the Skyvans, which can take relief supplies into the hinterland. But aviation. And there are over 30 what I call local strips in the hinterland, local airstrips. And of course, we have regional aerodromes, and these are more important. The regions, each one of our capital tongues has what I would describe as an aerodrome as opposed to an airstrip. And Mabaruma, Bartica, Madia, and Lethem are the main aerodromes. Of course, you've got places like Camarang and Matthews Ridge, which also have pretty long airstrips. But each capital tongue, in those 4 tongues that the coalition created, Region 1, 7, 8, and 9, has a major regional aerodrome, and of course you've got two international airports. So there's a difference between airstrip, aerodrome, and airport. And the two international airports are, of course, on the coast. One is at Eugene Corai and the other is at Cherry Jagan. And there are about there are probably more than 7 companies which service these regions and service these aerodromes and airstrips. And you know them very well. And they're very small companies and they operate very light aircraft. And I think that maybe in time to come, as you can see with the development of the petroleum industry, different types of aircraft are coming more advanced and people are bringing in helicopters. So there's going to be an intensification of air traffic and therefore demand for safety standards and management of aviation in Guyana. Not in years to come, but certainly in weeks and months to come. There are 2 important associations, as you know, the National Air Transport Association and the Aircraft Owners and the Aircraft Owners Association of Guyana. And sometimes, you know, they don't seem to be on good terms. But these are representative of the major operators in Guyana. And they have supported commerce. They've supported the communities. They serve the communities by facilitating access to public services. For example, casualty evacuation. Very frequently, serious cases in the hinterland, in all 4 hinterland regions, could only be brought to the major referral hospitals by air. So casualty evacuation is important. They supply essential goods, and certainly during emergencies, and the hinterland has a lot of emergencies, particularly flooding, and they get relief through aviation. And now that the petroleum industry is developing and has been gathering momentum over the last 7 years, you can see that there's a greater demand by these companies for aviation services. And therefore, there will be more aviation traffic, more air traffic, and more aircraft and more operators. And this is why aviation safety is important. It is not something we can ignore. It is not something that will happen on its own. It has to be planned for. And it is likely that within the next 3 to 5 years, and certainly in what I call the decade of development, aviation transport and aviation safety will be a much more important part of our development agenda. The Eugene Corai Airport at Ogle is becoming much more important, and a lot of people can travel to the near abroad, Barbados, Grenada, Trinidad, and Suriname from Eugene Corai. And it's very convenient. Rather than going all the way up to Temeri and going through the normal international procedures, you can just go to the international airport, the Eugene Corai International Airport, and you can be in Barbados in just a couple of hours, do your business, and be back, for dinner at night. So these are very convenient. The second international airport, and I'm quite sure that in our lifetime there'll be more international airports, so that people don't always have to come to Georgetown to go to some other destination. In fact, the airports, which are not really aerodromes as yet, in some areas, Mabaruba, Bartica, and Lethem, and eventually, I suppose, Madia, should be upgraded to international standards. So people don't always have to enter Guyana through Eugene Corai or Chedi Jagan. I recall on one occasion, I was at Mabaruma, and there was one man speaking French and another man speaking Spanish, and somebody else speaking Russian. So people are coming in to do mining and other business, and these aerodromes and in the hinterland are prepared to allow foreigners. Of course, there's the actual immigration procedure to be adhered to. They're prepared to allow foreigners to enter without even passing through Georgetown or Ogle. So that's very important. And these airstrips, unfortunately, some of them were apparently not properly engineered or designed, and they are very problematic. Some of the gold miners just scratched the surface of the earth and they cleared away some bush. And that might have been good when you had some simple Cessna aircraft. But now you try to introduce more sophisticated aircraft. We've been having some accidents. And a lot of money will have to be spent, not only on the surface of those aircraft, but also the approaches of the aircraft. And of course, most of the hinterland is covered with tropical jungle. And it means that pilots sometimes have to come in very high and then suddenly come down to the air. But I don't want to go into that. I'm not a technical person in terms of aviation. But it is clear that some of those airstrips are not engineered for modern aircraft. And this has been the source of some of the accidents which have been taking place. But certainly for the four capital towns, Bartica, Mabaruma, Mahdia, and Lethem, we need to develop those aerodromes in order to handle international traffic. And there are other airstrips, of course. As you know, during the era of the Ghana Sugar Corporation, there were many airstrips, Albion, Rose Hall, Skeldon, which were used for spraying the crops. So the airships are still there. They're not really in good shape. And then the rice industry uses some aircraft, some airstrips. And the bauxite industry actually had airstrips at Kokwani and Linden. So you have company strips. And some of them do not attract the same level of maintenance as, that they deserve. And they're used basically still for company purposes. So rice, sugar, and bauxite, their strips, have reported some accidents, sometimes some very bad accidents because, well, I don't want to go into the reason, but they certainly need to be engineered up to modern standards. My friends, aviation is very important. It supports employment of over 3,500 persons. And they earn salaries of over $3.5 billion or thereabout dollars a year. They contribute $6.8 billion to GDP. Every year, aviation, domestic aviation moves about 53,000 passengers. It's busy. If you were to go to Mahdi or Ogle, you'll be surprised at the traffic and let them, that takes place every day. They move 30,000 tons of freight every year. So aviation is not something we could dismiss. And if it's such an important industry, it must be safe for people and safe, of course, for the operators too. So you can see Guyana's hinterland is heavily dependent on aviation for supplies of food, for fuel, for personnel transport, for goods, medical evacuation, tourism, and commerce. Now, domestic aviation has had its difficulties. I don't want to use the cliche, it had a checkered history, but it is improving. There were some very bad periods. For example, between 2012 or thereabouts, there were 2012 to 2022, we've had many accidents caused by pilot error, mechanical problems, engine failure, and of course adverse weather. And you can see sometimes going into the hinterland, during rainy season, particularly in the May June rains, you can have a lot of accidents. In fact, I reckon, just anecdotally, that most of the accidents in the Kuyuni-Mazruni region, Region 8, occurred during the May June period. That is a very difficult period for flying, and in fact, some uh, foreign embassies have warned their citizens against flying in light aircraft to certain parts of Guyana's hinterland, but that's another matter. And the accidents cause injury, they've caused deaths in some cases, they've caused damage to the property, and of course the public infrastructure. And some pilots have had their licenses suspended, and some aircraft operators have been censured by the Guyana Civil Aviation Authority. And it is something that we need to be careful about. We can't say we're attracting tourists and then planes crash. We can't say we want to develop the hinterland and then the planes crash. People feel that Guyana's hinterland is unsafe. And the facts speak for themselves. It is not propaganda. The facts speak for themselves. You just look at the record and you can see that, in between 1996 and 2006, for example, it was a deadly decade. 20 accidents, 7 deaths. And there have been 30 incidents and accidents in the 7 years between 2015 and 2022. 5 lives were lost. Every year, there are about 10 accidents, 10 to 12 accidents, almost every month. On average, there is an aircraft accident, maybe minor, maybe major, but the numbers add up. And every accident is reported by the International Civil Aviation Authority. And this is how foreign visitors get a profile, get a picture of aviation safety in Guyana. It is not, again, propaganda. The facts speak for themselves. So, my friends, aviation accidents are still taking place. And of course, some accidents you cannot blame Guyanese operators because some are caused by illegal aircraft landing in places which are not registered strips in Guyana because they're bringing narcotics or guns or some other contraband. Accidents have occurred even over the last 2 years, since August 2020. We've had accidents at Isano. We've had accidents at Kuruduni. We've had accidents at Bisarunis. Some of you may not know where these places are. They're all in the hinterland. Accidents at Edringbang, which is probably well known. Accidents at Aricheng. Accidents at Kokwani, at Higgs Bosch. Well, of course, that is, that is the municipal dump site, landfill site, Higgs Bosch. But when a plane is crashing there on the approach to Ogle, you can see that it was really in trouble. We've had accidents at Camarang, accidents at Madia, accidents at Ogle, as you know, plane ran off the airstrip at Ogle, and accidents again at Ettringbang. These are not secrets. These are all being published in the daily media, and they paint a grim picture of aviation safety in Guyana. We therefore have to turn our attention to what it takes to make Guyana's airspace safe, to save human lives and to prevent accidents which cause injury, deaths, damage. And yes, there's a Civil Aviation Authority, and that is responsible for regulating aviation sector and ensuring compliance with international standards. All aviation in Guyana must comply with international standards. That is, you're not allowed to fly kites, which are not properly maintained, or pilots are not to fly them if they're not properly certified. So there's a lot of legislation. The legislation is in place. You cannot blame the legislation. You have to look at the human factor. The legislation cannot enforce itself. We have to look at the Civil Aviation Act, which is concerned with aviation oversight. We have to look at the Civil Aviation Air Navigation Regulations, which prohibit aircraft from being flown unless they're registered by a recognized institution. You have to look at the air transport licensing of air transport services regulations, which prohibit aircraft from being flown without civil aviation registration. You have to look at the civil aviation security regulation, civil aviation air traffic services, and rules for aviation regulations, which cater for aviation safety. In other words, my friend, the legislation is in place. Maybe you can dot I's and cross T's, but there's no lack of legislation to regulate uh, aviation in the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. The laws are in place, and the Guyana Civil Aviation Authority is the authority, the competent authority to certify pilots and to conduct aircraft inspections and investigations. Not only inspections, but investigations. So we are in a situation in which, despite legislation, we have had so many accidents, and unfortunately, some of them have been fatal. And we must therefore ask ourselves as Guyanese, is it safe to fly in our own country? We have so much to depend on, such a big part of the economy, mining and tourism, um, managing the hinterland. So much of government, so much of the economy is dependent on aviation that we cannot allow it to be unsafe. And we cannot allow the reputation of Guyana as a modern country to be jeopardized by so many accidents. Uh, and it will obviously impair development. It will obviously not only destroy the confidence people have in Guyana, but the bottom line is that it costs Guyanese lives. And that is what we must try to prevent, the loss of life. So we have arrived at a situation now in 2022, after over nearly 110 years since aviation came into Guyana. Over 100 years, but I mean, more actively over the last 70 years or so, aviation has been transformed. I remember as a young officer going into the hinterland, we used old World War II Grumman aircraft. You know, they would land in the river and then you'd have to get into a boat to get to the land. And of course, the Rheinveld, what is now the Coast Guard headquarters, used to be a ramp. So the Grumman Goose aircraft would go up on the ramp. And then there was the DC-3. Again, the DC-3s were the workhorses of troop transport in the Second World War for short distances. And those DC-3 aircraft were the workhorses in Guyana. As I said, they took the troops into Rupununi to suppress the rebellion in January 1969. But things are changing. Those aircraft, the old Grummans and the Dakotas and the Helicorias, have given way to more advanced aircraft. Now we don't even have the Twin Otters that helped us to secure the New River in 1969. So we have to ensure that legislation is kept abreast with these changing aircraft types and the changes taking place in the aviation industry, the domestic aviation industry particularly. We have to look at the administration. That is, we have to ensure that the Civil Aviation Authority has the staff, competent staff, to administer this important sector of our economy. We have to look at regulation. That is, there must be inspectors, there must be investigations, and there has to be implementation. There's no point having legislation and there's no implementation. So in Guyana, the Civil Aviation Authority has to contend with Guyanese terrain. And sometimes a plane would crash and actually disappear under the canopy. You know, when you fly over Guyana's in hinterland, you know, it looks like a big bowl of broccoli. But sometimes planes actually disappear and they're never found. It could be very treacherous, and the tendency in the past has been to use the Guyana Defense Force Special Forces, but the area is so vast and the canopy is so thick that sometimes small planes cannot be found, and it has happened in the past. So we have a difficult terrain. The weather patterns are different, very different from the coastline. The rainfalls can be very intense, and sometimes the wind, and of course, there are fewer navigation aids because sometimes miners would construct their own airstrips, but they, they they are sometimes outside of the capability of the control tower at Temeri. To That's why so many illegal aircraft could land, and sometimes the people at Temeri cannot say whether or not they've landed. So it's not just navigational aids. There has to be some uh, acquisition. There has to be some acquisition equipment which can detect anytime any aircraft enters Guyana airspace, and we must be able to counter that, especially if the entry is a hostile or illegal one. So our terrain is difficult. We are not an island, and it is impossible to control this vast land space without improved equipment, drones, surveillance equipment, radar, in order to ensure that our airspace is secure. And there have been overflights by Venezuelan aircraft, sometimes hostile, sometimes to harass our own troops. And the big danger now is the possibility that transnational criminals could bring illegal narcotics and guns into the country and land an aircraft. And if you look at the pattern of illegal landing, you can see that invariably these illegal landings, sometimes they're not discovered until there's an accident. There's a crash and maybe the propeller is damaged or there's some other mechanical fault. And it is only then that the event or the incident hits the news and people put up their hands. But it happens, it's been happening with greater intensity over the last 2 years. It means that there are people on the ground here who are aware that these illegal flights are taking place. And of course, they might be complicit. So these are some of the challenges that affect domestic aviation, civil aviation. And it's a danger because innocent civilian flights could be taking place and illegal foreign flights could also be taking place in Guyana's airspace. So aviation in Guyana has to face challenges. Number one, we need a core of trained and certified air traffic controllers. And my friends, we mustn't fight down public servants. These people work hard, and we must not fight down public servants in any branch. They are the backbone of government in this country. And I think we must do justice to all of our public servants, make sure they're well trained and certified. There is a limited number of aviation inspectors that, given the sheer size of the country and the number of airstrips, there must be a core of inspectors who can go out and ensure that the airstrips don't deteriorate because of bad weather or because of damage or because of cattle straying, and that they're maintained in a safe condition. We're concerned with safety. There are limited facilities for larger aircraft. And because of the petroleum industry, different types of aircraft are going to be coming into the country. And some of the smaller aircraft are not suitable for carrying cargoes or passenger loads into the hinterland. And the traffic in the hinterland to the hinterland is increasing. And you will eventually need to get a larger aircraft to go into more of these hinterland locations, not only the capital towns, but also some other locations in the far south. Sometimes you hear promises being made to develop airstrips. Well, every new airstrip will require more inspection, more construction, more implementation of regulations. And the traffic will become heavier because there's more mining taking place. And more people are coming into the country and going into the hinterland, not only for mining, but also um, uh, for tourism, to look at our flora and fauna. There must be better coverage of the entire country with navigational aids so that wherever aircraft fly, we must be able to guarantee them the best in navigational aids and also the best meteorological reports so that we don't have some of the accidents that we've been having and the fatal accidents we've been having over the past years. And there must be, improved and modern air traffic control system. And we can't rely on some of the old practices where everything is based on human faculties. We must be able to have the type of equipment which can give accurate information about navigation, particularly air traffic control. My friends, the four capital towns, which were established by the coalition at Mabaruma, Bartica, Mahdi, and Lethem, also serve as ports of entry, which means that there are other ports of entry. For example, Kellan is a port of entry. Bartica, New Amsterdam, I think, is a port of entry. And it means that those places with airdromes or airstrips require facilities which can handle international passengers. And this means that not only immigration, but also language proficiency is important. And these places need proper municipal terminals, terminal buildings, modern terminal buildings, with immigration and other facilities that you can get in developed countries. Having a benab there and a shack, when you have sophisticated, and I say sophisticated in the sense that you have some very smart businessmen coming in. And if your immigration is lax, or if you do not have the governmental supervision and surveillance of these strips, we can be letting a lot of criminal elements or undesirable elements into the country. The maintenance of these airstrips don't last forever. That's the roads on the coastline don't last forever. The airstrips in the hinterland don't last forever. The weather sometimes is more intense. The rainfall is heavy, and damage, could be very, very heavy. Some areas, I'm a bit surprised. I flew in a plane once, and the pilot was dodging potholes. You think it's a street in some coastal region, and that shouldn't happen. That should not happen. You shouldn't have cattle straying across the airstrips. You shouldn't have potholes. You should be safe, and that's important. So we need to see a higher degree of collaboration among the ministries, at least half a dozen ministries. I can think of the Foreign Affairs Ministry because of the implications of transnational crime. Home Affairs Ministry, again, for the same reason. Now you have 4 police divisions where you used to have 1 in regions 1, 7, 8, and 9. So the police, through the Ministry of Home Affairs, must play a bigger role in aviation security. Legal affairs, again, upgrading legislation to ensure that the Guyanese legislation is abreast with modern requirements, international requirements. Local government, the 4 capital towns come under the Ministry of Local Government and Regional Development. Natural resources, then again, you have natural resources which is responsible for a lot of the mining and logging in the hinterland. And as I said, some of these miners create their own strips, and they're not safe. they could jeopardize or endanger the lives of other people, not only the miners themselves, but also the ordinary people who use them on an everyday basis. And then Ministry of Public Works, which has responsibility for the actual construction of those ministries, and also it's the parent body of the Ghana Civil Aviation Authority. So when there's a crash at Camarang or Etringbang, the Ministry of Public Works has to ensure that the causes of those accidents are thoroughly investigated, and the recommendations, to prevent a recurrence are implemented. So the GDF has a role to play, particularly in the border location. The police have a role to play. Civil Aviation Authority have a role to play. All of these agencies have parent ministries. And the Ghana Civil Aviation Authority, the GCA, must develop the capability to enforce compliance on the aircraft operators and to conduct countrywide surveillance. There should not be any part of the 216,000 square kilometers which is not covered by some form of surveillance by the Civil Aviation Authority. I am of the view that aviation safety can be assured by enhancing the capability of the Civil Aviation Authority, enforcing stricter compliance with safety standards, expanding hinterland aerodrome rehabilitation. This is continuous. No aerodrome lasts forever. Rehabilitation has to be continuous. Extending airspace monitoring and surveillance, establishing permanent search and rescue, not ad hoc. You don't wait till an accident occurs and then try to put together a search and rescue team. It could have a search team, it wouldn't be a rescue team. By the time the boys get on the ground there, it's too late. So you need to have a search and rescue facility which can respond almost instantaneously to any accident, so that you can save people who can be saved. And there must be a permanent inspection and investigation service, so that maybe if we know that some operator is trying to cut corners or not fulfilling his or her obligations, before the plane takes off, before a flight occurs, we can, try to determine whether that flight is likely to be safe. And of course, we need well-paid, well-trained, and highly motivated air traffic control officers. Very important, very important. All the public servants involved in aviation safety must be treated with respect. And the government, every government must ensure that its public servants are well-trained, well-paid, and allowed to perform their functions. That is the purpose of a public servant. It's a permanent agency for ensuring that the country is well-run. Politicians come, politicians will go. You can see what is happening in other countries. But the public service must be treated with greater respect. My friends, I am of the view that administrators and aviators could do well to collaborate to ensure passenger safety is made more central to governmental operations. And in my view, greater passenger safety, greater aviation safety will encourage public confidence in the capacity of the government, any government, to prevent aviation accidents. We must do more to keep our airways safe. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Let us cooperate for the young. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must do his